Okay, continuing on, we are discussing again slavery in the Bible, slavery in the Old Testament. We have moved on to Exodus chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, and we're specifically discussing the what I would call the strange or the odd-looking post-release clauses stipulated in verses 1 through 4. We've looked at two possible scenarios in which a slave may be released. We're going to look at the third scenario now, and that is Exodus 21 verses 4 through 6. Apparently the slave is single in, married during, and single out with or without the kids. Now this part of the passage seems to cause the most trouble because this seems odd at first, very odd at first glance, but apparently the slave owner has some type of financial interest in the wife because the slave owner gave the wife to the slave. So like all marriages, and again, we've already discussed marriage in ancient Israel, and if you haven't had a chance to go back and look, 2 videos back, I believe, I already discussed how marriages were arranged in ancient times, and especially in ancient Israel. You might want to take a look at that to become familiar with what's actually being discussed here. Again, marriages were arranged, money exchanged hands. So again, the slave owner has some type of financial interest in the wife because the slave owner gave the wife to the slave. So like all marriages, a financial transaction would have to take place for the slave to leave with the wife that the slave owner had provided. This sets up a special set of circumstances in which this could have been dealt with by the slave. First of all, the slave could invoke a clause of permanent servitude, which we've already also discussed, and stay forever in the situation with security, familiarity, and family. This is the slave choice and option. Second possibility here. Secondly, the slave could negotiate a marriage mohair payment and leave with the wife and kids. And remember, marriages among free people, there was money that exchanged hands. This mohair payment was part of the deal. It had to take place. Quoting from a history of ancient Near Eastern law, slaves received wages. They were capable of owning property, could pay betrothal money or fines. This possibility took several different forms. First of all, we know that a person could continue to work and provide services inside the household as a post-servant and earn the bride price, much like what Jacob did when he earned the right to marry Rachel and Leah. You can read about that story in Genesis, I believe. According to a history of ancient Near Eastern law, in the ancient Near East, future services could be accepted by an owner as payment today. More frequently than a slave using their property to buy freedom, the slave was bound to support the former owner during the latter's lifetime. A slave is ceremonially bound by a support clause, but is also said to have redeemed himself, which suggests that his future services were seen as payment in fact, if not in law. Another way a slave could negotiate a payment, a mohair payment, is the post-servant could move out, assuming he had a place to go, arrange these terms and take his wife with him. And another possibility is the lavish gifts. The lavish gifts, a master was to provide lavish gifts with a slave upon exit. The lavish gifts the master was supposed to send the slave out with, according to Deuteronomy 15:15, could be used for payment or paid the bride price. So there's a few things that could happen here in order for if the slave wanted to take the wife and kids with him. Now, the other possibility is if the slave had not formed an emotional connection to the bride, he was free to leave on his own, which means the slave owner then took on the responsibility of the care for the wife and the children. These are just a couple of the easily conceivable scenarios of which there might be more. It's important to remember in an ancient culture in which every waking moment is used for survival, the community thrived off healthy relationships and survived because of the fertility associated with them. They would have had to have had a way to keep vibrant and loving couples together. So this case number 3, had a couple of different aspects to it, and upon analysis doesn't seem as odd as it first appeared. There's just too much flexibility in the marriage processes, economic situation, and servant institution for this to be a real problem for them, much less us. Now, this is a good place to discuss briefly the view of freedom from a Hebrew perspective. Freedom was seen much differently than it is today. In the ancient Near East, although some cultures had a pre-built debt payoff periods like Israel's 6 years, freedom from slavery was rare because it wasn't sought after. The issues of economic security and the quasi-family relationships that developed within the household unit created little incentive to become an independent or free person. Quoting from an Encyclopedia of Cultural Anthropology, 1996, more usually individual autonomy has meant exposure to danger and predation. Safety lay precisely in the protection afforded by the bondage of dependence on groups and patrons. What was desirable was not freedom, but belongingness. Okay. Now, I've discussed at length entry into slavery, and I think I've clearly demonstrated that what was happening in the Old Testament, what was sanctioned in the Old Testament, was clearly different than from what we know as slavery today. Now I want to turn my attention and consider the legal status of slaves. When it comes to slavery as we understand it and as we know it, there is no legal or ethical demands upon the owners as to how they treated their property, that being the slaves. Slaves were considered property much like furniture is considered property, and other than the occasional benevolent master, only economic value was the main deterrent to abusive treatment. Theoretically, some expressions of New World slavery, just lost my page here, of New World slavery had some protection from outright murder of a slave, but this was not very widely accepted, and the right to kill differed among groups. Now, turning our attention back to the Old Testament, although slaves were viewed as the property of the heads of the household, the latter were not free to brutalize or abuse even non-Israelite members of the household. On the contrary, explicit prohibitions of the oppression and exploitation of slaves appear repeatedly in the Mosaic law and legislation. And two of the most remarkable texts, Leviticus 19:34 and Deuteronomy 10:19, Yahweh charges all Israelites to love aliens who reside in their midst, that is, the foreign members of their household, like they do themselves, and to treat those outsiders with the same respect they show their ethnic countrymen. Leviticus 19:34 says, "And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be with you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You shall not do injustice in judgment and measurement of length, weight, and volume." And Deuteronomy 10:19 says, "Therefore love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, and you shall serve him, and him you shall hold fast and take oaths in his name." Like Exodus 22:20, in both texts, Israel's memory of her own experience as slaves in Egypt should have provided motivation for compassionate treatment of her servants and slaves, whether foreign or Hebrew. But Deuteronomy 18:10 adds that Israelites were to look at Yahweh himself as a paradigm for treating the economically and socially vulnerable in their communities. Additionally, slaves were considered property in exclusion to their humanity. And I'm going to pick this part up in my next video.